Yeah, so bore da pawb, croeso. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session on gaming. We're very excited to have such fantastic people from across the gaming sector at this first of our gaming panels that we've ever run, actually, as part of Cult Cymru. So my name is Sian Gale, and I'm the Skills and Development Manager for Cult Cymru. And we've been running now since 2008. And as you can see from the top of the screen, we're a joint union programme run via BECTU, but working in partnership with Equity, the MU, and the Writers Guild. But the important thing about today is about the gaming. So when Annalisa came on board, one of the challenges I set her was that we wanted to do a panel session and more on gaming, because as our people on the panel will tell us, it is a growing sector. And sometimes people need maybe a bit of an understanding of the different sectors to see whether there's opportunities for them, either because they aren't being able to do all the work they can because of the COVID-19 situation, or they want to add another string to their bow anyway. So that's one of the reasons that we have in the panel session today. And the brief was to have a diverse panel so that we can see that there are a broad range of people in the industry, and that if you look at the 4 unions we're talking about, that the panel is going to be relevant to people from across the 4 unions. And 100 out of 100 for Annalisa, she's managed to, seems to have managed to have pulled it off. So da iawn i ti Annalisa. So that's all from me, and I hope you enjoy this session. I am absolutely thrilled to be at this session, so I'm really looking forward to it. So draw i ti, Annalisa. Diolch yn fawr pawb.
Diolch, Sian. Without further ado, if I could ask the panel just to briefly introduce themselves and what area they specifically work in. So we'll start off with Amelia.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Amelia Tyler. I'm a voice actor for video games and anything else that will have me, really. Voice actors are sort of the littlest hobos of the entertainment industry, so we go wherever there is work. What would you know me from? I'm the narrator of Baldur's Gate 3, which is out in early access now. I was in Divinity Original Sin 2 playing Malady. I was in Pathfinder Kingmaker, and a whole bunch of other things from AAA to indies. I love it. I've done all sorts of different acting in my life, but this is kind of where I found my home in the games industry. It's not where the money is, but it's where my heart is.
Good, great. That's the important thing. So, Kevin, you'd like to go next?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Kevin. I'm a games designer / like tech designer. Released the game called Move with Mochi Mode, which is a company I kind of co-founded on the back of winning Transfuser 2017. I know it's so long ago now. And now I'm basically working as a freelancer tech designer for a game called Blue Oak Bridge. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And Stafford Bowler.
Hi, yeah, I guess I would call myself a game audio consultant. So I create audio content for video games, which ranges from pretty much everything from music to sound effects, voice direction. I specialize as a technical sound designer and troubleshooter as well. So occasionally I get brought onto projects where they're having performance issues or tidying things up, things like that. And yeah, and I work from home in Cardiff.
Great. Ian?
Hello, I'm Ian. Excuse me. Victim of COVID. And I'm a writer, narrative designer, and coder. I these days spend most of my time either writing dialogue or text for games, or sorting out top-level story issues, going in as a consultant.
You're going a bit low. You're dipping in sound a bit, Ian. Yeah.
Sorry, that better. Going in as a story consultant on games. I've worked on, I think, 60 games.
Still a bit low.
5
Still a bit low.
years.
You were really, really clear, and then you suddenly dipped
It's
out a bit.
Weird. Is that working? Is that working? Testing.
Sean, can you hear? Oh, you're on mute, Sean.
It's low level, Ian. If you could get near to the mic.
This is the mic. This is yeah.
I think it's auto correcting itself.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to go on to die and I'll have a
Yeah.
play with some settings?
Yeah, that sounds better already. Yeah, we'll go on to Di. Thanks, Kevin. It's great to have some techies in the room. Di, if you'd like to introduce yourself. Dr. David Banner, I should say.
Yes, well, Shulk. My name's David Banner. So for the last 26 years, I've been a games industry professional. So in that time, I've been an artist, writer, producer, director, and an entrepreneur as well. Currently, I'm co-founder and managing director of Wales Interactive, probably the most successful games company there's ever been in Wales, and we're a multi-award winning video games and interactive movie publisher and developer.
Great, lovely. So, Di, if you can kick us off, everything about the video games industry in 5 minutes. No.
Oh my God, you go.
I'm joking. No, you've got 10 minutes. That's okay. Yeah, just give us an overview of where it's at the moment.
Well, thanks. I would say the biggest stat is that the video games business is now bigger than film and music combined. So it's not emerging, it's emerged. You know what I mean? It's gone past that. So in the UK, there's over 2,000 games companies in the UK, and they range from big companies like Rockstar that hire hundreds to literally, indie developers like Kevin, basically, one-person bands or two-person bands upwards. And then over that time, I suppose my 26 years in the games industry, the evolution has been boys in bedrooms. The demographic has changed considerably, and not just the people playing games, but the genres, which have opened it up. So if you compare it to cinema, there was a time when cinema started, it was only in black and white and for slapstick comedy, whereas games was perceived to be for kids and a certain sort of type of game, and now that's totally been blown, out of the water in the last few years, really. So games is, in my household, my son who's 10 plays games, my daughter who's 15 plays games, my wife who's in her 40s plays games, me, the wrong side of 40s, play games. My mother-in-law does, and she's 65, and my father-in-law do. We don't all play Fortnite together, but we all play different games on different devices. So that creates then an opportunity for all the different professionals that you heard today. Like I said, I am a video games designer. That's my background as an artist. Like I'm not a programmer. I came from an art background. But the opportunities now for interactive entertainment, we make interactive movies as well. So that uses all the disciplines that are in the feed today, but it's a different way of using your discipline to make and sell film in the gaming area, not in the traditional film area. Anything else for an overview for games? I mean, I could be forever, but essentially in Wales, the industry is still indie, I would say. There's not one big dominating huge corporate company. There's lots of little satellite companies. Because we are a developer, we are self-sufficient Wales Interactive, we are not financed by anybody. So, even though we release on PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, we create our own things, we publish our own things, we make our own audience. The majority of the money comes back into our bank account. So we are self-sufficient. So with that model, we team up with other indies. I know Kevin pretty well from the Transfuser project, actually. So we also help other creators create interactive things that we help them publish all around the world to be self-sufficient. So Wales is really more of an indie sort of satellite development hub at the moment, rather than I suppose like different parts of the UK have bigger companies which are sort of more feeding from the workforce there. We are still in little pockets all around Wales.
Yeah, because I've just had a question coming up. How far are we behind the Northeast, such as Rockstar?
Yeah, well, you say far behind, don't forget now, right? Even though I'm based in Wales, I sell games in every country in the world from the Rhondda, right? Our biggest market is China, actually, right? And I don't speak Cantonese or I don't speak the language. So even though we talk about location, what COVID has shown, the games industry actually hasn't been hit by the pandemic. In fact, we've thrived because of the way that we work. So obviously, you know, we're all in this Zoom world now. But I mean, the way games teams communicate anyway is set up for you know, using servers, online working methods, and ways of communicating. So I wouldn't say saying an area is behind. I mean, technologically, we're not. The people who are working in the games industry in Wales, you know, are up there. It's just that I suppose traditionally it's been a hidden thing rather than a visible thing. So obviously, you know, people looking for work will look for what jobs are out there. And traditionally, there's not been a lot of jobs advertised in Wales for the gaming sector.
Yeah. Actually, on that point, we could go to Ian. Ian, are you with us?
I hope so. Yep.
Yeah, that's really loud and clear. So yes, on that point, because you're obviously in Sweden at the moment, Ian, if you just give us a quick, brief intro to your area of expertise.
And why I'm in Sweden, sure.
Yeah.
So as I tried to say earlier, I work on story things for games mostly, so writing and dialogue and sorting out story issues, troubleshooting stories, that sort of thing. I think I've worked on 60 titles in the last 5 years, something like that. And I lived in Cardiff for 20 years, and we set up a company there where everybody worked remotely from home, a cooperative company, and everybody involved in that. We were freelancers, and we banded together to for a bit of self-defense, as Sean was talking about earlier. But because we've all been working remotely with companies all over the world for years, it doesn't really matter where we are. We've got 2 partners in Canada. We've got 1 in England, 2 in England, and me here in Sweden. So that's 5 of us cooperating, and we work with other people all over the place, including Di, including Amelia, and talking to Kevin. So I think what Di was saying there about whether a region is behind or not, that mattered 5 to 10 years ago now, but particularly with what's gone on last year, the games industry was very well placed to switch to working remotely. I've worked remotely in the industry for 10 years, and there are so many jobs being advertised now where the company, even the biggest companies out there, are going, you know, we might not go back to this idea of everybody being in a studio, or maybe we'll only do it for meetings, or maybe we'll do it once a month. So you don't have to be geographically close anymore. Time zones are an issue, is probably the only thing. Working from the UK for somebody in the States is harder. If it's short sessions, the sort of thing that Amelia does, it's easier, but full time won't really work. But anywhere around Europe, Brexit permitting, freelancing is perfectly feasible from wherever you happen to be.
Yeah, that's great. So I'd like to go into a bit more detail about what everybody does. As we have you now, Ian, let's kick off with Ian. So, you know, how did you get started, and what is it that you do? Because, you know, you're described as a narrative designer. What does that actually mean, you know, to the writers in the room who are interested?
How do I get started is a really long and complicated thing, and it's one of those things where, particularly games writers, you'll find everybody's got a different answer to that. There's no sort of standardized route into the industry. There's no kind of normal pathway into the industry at all. I mean, writing hasn't been considered a huge part of games for until really only the last 10 years. So there aren't really formal routes in. Mine is complicated. I used to be a coder and designer, and was writing in the evenings, and eventually got fed up of doing 16 hours a day of work, and managed to collapse it down to about 10 in theory, and gave up most of the coding, and I'm now doing writing. But that's actually really useful because there are key differences for writing and narrative designing a game. So the difference between those 2 roles, just to be clear, writing is pretty straightforward. Writing is doing the words, whether that's dialogue, whether that's text that appears on screen. But it's worth bearing in mind that is not linear in the way that the scripts for TV film are linear. You can have little sections, which are like little cutscenes, which are little sections from normal scripts and might exist in a sort of standard script format or might not. But too often, the lines that you're dealing with are things which might happen at any time in the game. The player might do anything in any order. You might have lines shouted by other characters in the game, and you've no idea what they're going to say, when they're going to say it, or what was the previous line. So that requires a huge shift of mindset.
Yeah,
Narrative.
I think
Sorry,
just to interrupt for a second. Yes, I think we had a quick intro to video games writing from Andy Walsh a while back, and I was surprised. There's actually people who specialize just in writing those reactions from people, those particular script. Are they still called scripts? I don't know.
Those are called barks. Those particular
Barks,
lines are called barks. Those reaction lines.
Okay.
So that's the writing side, and having a bit of a technical idea is really helpful because you can understand why lines might get triggered, which is kind of key, really. And having experience of playing games is crucial to it. Understanding how games function. Just migrating from normal writing to games is very different. And the other big difference, which is where I move into narrative design, is about the storytelling and about how the story is presented. So narrative design really is the art of how you tell the story to the player using whatever you have available, whether that's using art, whether that's using audio, whether that's using in-game assets, whether that's using, it could be almost anything. It can be the way you animate characters. It can be the way that you bring up the music at the right point. So it's basically, how do we deliver this story that we want to tell to the player in a way that works, and that they can interact with. And the key thing and the key difference is that film and TV, you are an audience to a story. A story is happening and you're an audience to it. In games, almost always the story is centered around the player and the player experience of the story, and they drive it at their own speed. You can't control the pacing, you can't control kind of any of the viewpoints, and you are trying to deliver a thing in which the player feels like they're at the center of the experience rather than a floating head watching it, which is too often what happens in cinema and film. So it's quite a different mindset.
Yeah, one thing again, going back to basics, I mean, in terms of the story, I mean, what comes first? Does the world come first? Who creates that world? Is it the writer? Is it the games developer, the designer? We'll be talking to Kevin in a bit about this. But from the writing perspective, I mean, does it vary from game to game? What comes first?
It entirely varies. Every studio does something different. In, I guess, what I'd call traditional AAA story-based games, AAA games, which are the sort of big games out there, typically the game starts with an experience, the idea of a core experience, whether that's racing a car around the streets, whether it's playing football, whether it's fighting hordes of orcs as you run across Middle Earth, or whatever it is. It tends to come from the experience first, and the top-down story tends to come from that direction, from the gameplay experience direction, and then the story gets papered on afterwards. That's historically been how it's done over the last 10 years, partly because of the democratization of the tools, the easy access to tools. People have been coming into the industry from other backgrounds, things like writers and designers, from more, let's say, media backgrounds or creative backgrounds, and they don't feel forced to work in that kind of traditional coder, programmer, designer way. And so there are people creating games where they absolutely put the story first, and that's the very first thing they come up with, and then they have to figure out how that translates into an experience. But every company does it in a slightly different way, and even defining terms like writer, narrative designer, audio engineer, it varies massively from company to company what the responsibilities of each of those roles is.
Right. Yeah. Moving on to Kevin. Hi, Kevin.
Hello.
So again, what is it that you do? Just tell me what you do in layman's terms.
So like, I kind of call myself a tech designer, but like in practice, I am a games designer. I work on all of the mechanics, all of the balancing, and all of that to do with video games. But I've started like diving into more of a tech developer role with like, actually importing assets, like making them work, configuring all of it like in the engine. So that's why I say more like tech designer than games designer, because I like to be more hands-on with a project, So yeah, that's basically everything I do. I've worked as a level designer before and stuff like that. So anything like design based that kind of makes the game flow is kind of like key to what I do, you know.
Mm-hmm. So how did you get started? What's your background?
I started off, you know, studying in university, as most people do, and then the Transfuser, the competition that like my team won, that was a postgraduate kind of competition. So there was only it only allowed like universities to apply and stuff like that. So once we won that, that kind of like kickstarted everything for me in my like, I guess, professional career. But then I guess like after we released that game, everyone like it wasn't really sustainable because it's really tough to like, you know, kind of like break that barrier. So then I just honestly, it was a lot of luck with how I got this job right now, but it's how you like manipulate your odds. So I kept going to like the Games Wales meetups all the time and all of that. Like you have to like kind of find all of these positions that you could possibly fill, and like you kind of have to will it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So just going to Games Wales all the time. I started getting like chummy with this one guy, and we used to like hang out quite a bit. And through that, he just he had this design opportunity for me, and through that, I got this job now, which is fantastic. I get to work full time, like game designing, tech designing, you know.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
a lot of fun.
Yeah. So at uni, just going back quickly to so at uni, did you study a games design course? What was it that you actually
Yeah,
read at university?
I studied a course that doesn't exist now. It lasted for like I think 2 rounds, called Game Enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like a brother course to games design. This was at University of South Wales. But now Games Enterprise is the master's course. So I did like my bachelor's and then went into master's, and it effectively taught you everything from conceptualizing an idea to implementing it yourself. So yeah, that's basically what I studied. And like the masters especially, it kind of like gave you the opportunity to kind of dive into whatever aspect of games like creation and development that you wanted to. And I chose to do like kind of a bit of programming. I'm not a coder. I do like visual scripting, for anyone who knows about that. And other than that, yeah, it was a lot of games design and just like learning how things are implemented in engine. There was a question as well, what engines do you all use?
Mm-hmm.
I use both Unreal and Unity. I'm currently working in Unity right now.
Mm-hmm. So you just said something there, like did you say design visual scripting?
Yes.
So what is that? What is visual scripting?
So when you think about programmers, you think specifically coding, you know, like Java, C#, C++, and all of that. But visual scripting is effectively this it's this kind of beginner to intermediate tool it's packaged with Unreal, and it does all of the basics of coding, but in kind of like a graph sense. So you can like connect nodes together, and it's just a way for people to get into games design, get into games development without having to necessarily like learn coding for the like beginner of things, I guess. So
right.
I mean, it's doable to make a game in visual scripting strictly. It's not pretty because I did it, but yeah, it's definitely doable.
Okay, brilliant, great. So moving on to the music side, Stafford. Tell us a bit about, you know, how you got started and what it is that what does sound design mean in terms of video games? Yeah.
Sure. I think I would start with a large caveat, because I think there's a lot of expectations about music in games and from musicians in games. And certainly that's how I found my way into the industry 23 years ago, was that I was part of the rave scene in South Wales, and you know, doing techno and trance nights down in Newport and things like that. But I realized that it was finishing my degree. It wasn't something that was sustainable moving forwards. And, yeah, I kind of wanted to kind of carry on doing what I was passionate about, but in a more kind of structured sense. And I was fortunate enough to get a position with the developer in the Midlands as a musician stroke sound designer. And the reason that I was hired was not only because of the kind of the music production style that I could do, but I demonstrated a technical understanding, a willingness to deep dive and do sound creation as well as composing music. My daily job varies from project to project, but for the most part, I'm kind of curating audio content in terms of, and that's like sound effects, music, voice, and I design the systems for the audio to be triggered and used within a game. So I work quite closely with game designers, with the programmers especially, and we kind of work out what audio the project needs, create the assets, that's sound recording, working with voice actors like Amelia, sometimes recording Foley, but some people rely heavily on using their own recordings. I tend to work more with bespoke sound libraries, boutique sound libraries, things like that, because you know there's people who could spend their entire lives just recording sounds, and they're dedicated to their profession, and bring that all together and then place that into the game. And it's quite critical. It's important to have a good understanding of what the game needs, what games need in terms of functionality and design in order for your audio to work effectively. So sound editing, sound design and composing for games presents a lot of the same challenges that Ian was talking about compared to film and TV and linear media. You're dealing in video games, you're dealing with a world of eventualities, of possibilities. So, for example, because the player has agency in a game and can decide wherever they go or whatever they do to a certain extent, depending on what the game allows them to do, you have to plan for the eventuality that the player might just decide to spend 30 minutes jumping up and down in a corner of a certain room, or they may decide to not follow the set path that you'd originally planned for them. So you have to kind of work out what sounds are going to be required where, what's most important, what's going to happen most often, what's going to happen least often.
So you're talking about sound, but you're also talking about composing music.
Yes.
So
composing music is for games. It's challenging it really depends on the project and the context. If it's a very narrative driven game, then you might be expected to compose pieces of music that represent feelings or emotions or certain incidents within a game. Whereas if it's something more like, I don't know, like a racing game or a puzzle game, which is where the player may be spending large amounts of time performing the same activity over and over and over and over, you have to think about the player is going to be listening to your score, your music and your sound effects for tens, if not hundreds of hours, as opposed to a 2-hour film or a 50-minute TV program. So it may be the case that doing something with a really strong melodic identity is not going to be a good idea, because over 50 hours that's going to turn into an earworm, and it may not be the best kind of earworm, and the player might go, do you know what, I can't stand this music anymore, I'm going to turn it off. Which is the last thing you want as a composer or as a content creator. You want people to have the full experience. So again, it depends on context, but the kind of music that you create has to reflect what's happening. So puzzle games, I would tend to lead much more to very ambient kind of music, the kind of ambience that Brian Eno would have kind of like chased for, where, you know, it's noticeable by its absence rather than by its presence. Whereas, you know, a racing game, you may have aimed to write a wide selection of tracks that can be played as a playlist, or you may be talking to the programmers and the sound designers and creating an interactive piece of music. So that's where you have your musical tracks layered upon top of each other. And you talk about game conditions. So you're like thinking, right, is the player in first place? Are they on their final lap? And this is putting it very basically, if first place, if final lap, then equal really exciting music. If last place, final lap, equals really depressing music, you know, or hurry up music. I mean, that's really putting it basically. But that's the kind of challenges you have to think about.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions for you actually, Staff, but I'll just give you just one or two now. We've got a sound recordist here. I think it's a bit what you were talking about at the beginning. What options are there for my services? I'm imagining there would be a need for capturing FX sounds like cars, etc., for specific games. Do games companies use their own in-house people, or is there any scope for bringing in freelance sound recordists for this work?
There's definitely scope for freelancers, because as Di mentioned when he was talking, that, you know, the games industry varies from your multi-million pound AAA developers, you know, your rock stars, your Codemasters and so forth, right down to small indie developers, single person teams, you know, working from their houses. It's, you know, it's a competitive, it's a hugely, there's a huge amount of competition. But yeah, definitely. I would say a good place to start looking websites like soundeffects.com, Sonis, places like that, because there's lots of people releasing boutique sound libraries geared towards games, because traditionally sound effects libraries were always produced for linear media, you know, your Sound Ideas, your Hollywood Edge. And for video games, what you need is, in terms of sound recordings, is as many variations of the same sound as possible. So, you know, rather than putting a cup down 2 or 3 times, we actually want you to put it down 100 times with different amounts of force. So it's definitely, I would have a look at some of the boutique sound libraries that are out there that have been produced for games, because people like myself and all my peers, you know, those of us who don't have the time to go out and do recording for games, it's like, yes, we want more food to feed into the system, definitely.
Yeah, that's good. And just quickly, we've got one here. I'm a music composer, producer, interested in getting my music or writing specifically for the gaming industry. Looking for advice. I currently write for TV sync placements. How do I get my music to the right place?
It's tough. It's really difficult. I would say that the best place to start would be really to try and find someone locally who's maybe developing a small project, a small game, maybe an indie developer, and work with them to get your music into that project. Ideally, something that is going to head to release on Steam or somewhere like that, because the problem is that I get inundated with demo reels and requests from composers, game developers, and especially the big game developers get you know, dozens of CDs and demo reels sent through every week. And this is something that I say to composers and to people going into sound design, is if you can get your work into a project, even if it's just something that's released for free, if you can then show that to a bigger game developer or take that along to the develop conference or put it under people's noses and go, here is a game or here is a project with my music in or my sounds in, that will make a much bigger impression than just a show reel or a demo or anything like that.
That's great.
It's tough. It is very tough.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Really good advice, Steph. So, Amelia, you've been waiting patiently as our female representative in this business. I must hasten to add
the ovaries.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
I must add that we did, contact quite a few females as well. But it's true to say, I think that is a pretty still a male-dominated industry, although that is obviously changing. So if you could give us an overview of how you got started, Amelia, and what it is that you do, every day.
I got started in voice, not games specifically, but voice when I was 5 years old, so 1986. My mum was an actress, and she started doing voice work, mainly commercial and that side of things, when she had me and my sister, so she could spend a bit more time at home and she wasn't having to go off on tour. And she couldn't get a babysitter one day and took me along, and they were like, oh, we've got a Christmas commercial that requires a cute little kid in it. Let's see if she can read words. Go for it, kid. And it turned out I could indeed read words. And I've kind of never turned back. There was like an awkward teething period about 11 when they stop wanting you to sound cute and they start wanting you to be good at your job. And that was a lot of hours of just sitting in the booth training myself to do the things that they needed to do. It was a very conscious effort on my part. I definitely wanted to be good at this because I'm a first child and that's what we do. But games specifically, I didn't break into until quite recently. I think it was 5 years ago, maybe a little bit. Yeah, around that, I think. And until then, I don't think the industry was, this sounds very weird. I don't think the industry was ready for what it was that I can offer them, because I don't think the roles were as cinematic. I don't think the style of acting and the storylines that were in games wanted the style of acting that I'm best at. A lot of it was quite cartoony, and while that's something I dabble in occasionally, that's not where I live. And then suddenly The Last of Us comes out and the whole world just goes, we'd like people who sound like they're cinematic actors, or that they can follow an emotional storyline through. And I've come from a theatre trained, screen trained background with a huge amount of voice work behind me, mocap training, and I have a psychology degree. So you put those together and you're like, oh, that's where you live. Okay. And it was like finding home. I know I said it earlier, but it's never stopped being true. It was like opening a door and going, oh, this is where I'm supposed to live.
So I'm going to ask some basic questions again.
Do it.
So, because, you're talking about mocap, so I think that's motion capture, if I'm right.
Yeah, that's the lycra suits with all the balls on, so they can match.
So, but you've also got the voiceover side of things. So have you got games, where you're just doing voiceovers, and how does it work if you've got games where you're doing motion capture?
For the most part, there are two different sides of it. There's mocap, which is just the physical. There's mocap with facial capture, where you'll be doing full body and full face, but they won't be capturing your voice. And then there's full performance capture, where they capture everything. It's like cinematic acting, but without costume or props or sets. I would say the further you go down that road, the easier it gets. Getting a decent cinematic performance out of somebody in full performance capture, where you've got other people to talk to, and you've got your body and your physicality, you've got the approximation of where you are, is a hell of a lot easier than doing it stood still in front of a microphone with nobody to bounce off in a sound booth. And I think the industry over here is a little bit lagging behind LA, where there are a lot of very specific voice actors and it's respected as its own field. Whereas over here, it kind of feels like we're the poor cousin of screen actors, like, oh, they do the real acting, but you come in here. But I think slowly the industry, now that more cinematic storylines are starting to become required, I think they're slowly realizing that just because somebody can act on screen, it doesn't mean they can do it in a voice booth.
Yeah.
And voice acting in itself is becoming more of a, more respected is the wrong word because it makes it sound like, hey, respect my skills. But you know, I mean, it's a specialist skill and not everybody can do it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Do you have to, you know, were you somebody who played a lot of games? Were you into that anyway? Or did that come later?
Kind of is the answer. I will always be a puzzle gamer. That's what I was brought up on. Like, my dad had me playing, Treasure Island on the Commodore 64 when I was like 6 years old or something. That was my first experience of gaming, and I love that style of things. I didn't have a console till my 20s, so my thumbs are like these sad little meat popcorn things. It's pointless. So those kind of games will never be my thing. But I love, now that games have got more narrative, that's my side of things.
I think we see. Sean, I spotted a question. I can't find it out. Typical. It was about getting into that side of things.
Yeah, there were two actually, but they were near enough the same. What makes a voice reel stand out? What do you expect to hear as standard in a voice reel?
I would say, first off, forget what's standard, because there are enough of those. For me, what makes a voice reel stand out is somebody who knows who they are and what they're selling, and they're selling that. Because this is an oversubscribed industry. There are, especially now after COVID, everybody has a crappy USB mic and thinks that they're a voice actor. That's not what will sell you. Trying to be what somebody wants you to be. I mean, imagine it like a relationship. If somebody's like, just tell me what you want me to be, I'll do whatever you want. Like, that's not fun. I mean, maybe briefly, but you want somebody who's going to bring something to the table that you couldn't have told them to do. I have a very specific style of acting and a very specific mindset that all the other things that aren't related to my career have added to me and make me good at playing. I'm good at playing characters who've lived longer than humans have, who are used to seeing the world from slightly outside or from positions of authority. I play high status a lot, but always with that knowing smirk or a hint of befuddlement at being emotionally out of that water. I don't play very often the nice girl next door. I don't, you know, there are roles that I will deliberately take myself out of the pigeonhole for, because there are better people for that. So a long-winded way of saying, don't be like everybody else. Just figure out who you are. Whatever. Hello.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, that was my alarm.
Can I play it? That's a really good way of rehearsing characters, by the way. Just mess with cold callers until they go away.
That sounds like a really good tip, actually.
Lisa, there's several questions about, and I think, I'm not sure if people have sort of dabbled in answering it, but how, and you know, with this voice one as well, how would people go about in terms of approaching people to get work, in terms of having transferable skills?
That's a tricky one, especially now, because the social aspect of things is diminished at the moment. I would say there are a lot of companies out there who want to charge you lots of money to socialize and network and be part of a group, run screaming. They just want your money. They don't care whether or not you find work in this industry. The communities that exist are free. The best way I found personally, aside from going to events, which is obviously off the table right now, is Twitter. Like, just talk to people, and you can network without it being networking, because everybody sees networking coming a million miles off, and I don't think this is exclusive to voice acting. If you get the feeling that somebody is just trying to get money or work out of you and is looking over your shoulder to see if there's somebody more interesting in the room, you don't want to talk to that person, and it makes you feel used. Just find your tribe and let your tribe find you. Find people, even if they're no use to you whatsoever, or you don't know what they do, just chat to people and find out who you vibe with, because you never know the chain effect, because it's a very incestuous industry. You never know who knows, and how that's going to chain off. And in the meantime, you'll end up having some really cool conversations with some fun people.
Great, that sounds
Try
good.
not to network by networking.
Yeah.
That question,
Try
yeah.
not to.
I think that question was
Yeah.
to die in some of the employers as well, in terms of what they'd be looking for.
Yeah, I'm just quickly interrupting Ian. I know you have to jump, you have to go off in a minute for a phone call. We have a quick question on writing. Are you able to answer that before your call?
Yeah, I've got about 20 minutes or so, I think.
Oh, great. So, yeah, sorry, Sean, to interrupt. We'll go back to that. Just aware that Ian's got to leave us a bit earlier. As a writer, how would you go about writing for video games? How does the narrative process differ to TV and film?
Have we got about 3 hours?
Yeah.
Oh dear. It varies on the project very much. We have a bunch of different design techniques that we use, that if anybody wants to hunt up my Medium site, there are a whole bunch of articles on, but we base our designs around the player experience, how you want the player to feel at any given point, what you want them to come out with it, the stories that you want them to be telling other people about the game, that amazing bit when I was running away from that horrible monster, or whatever it happens to be. And if you can nail down how you want them to feel and the experience you want them to have, as I said earlier, remembering that the player is the core of the story, the player isn't an onlooker, then we base all the writing off that. We find how you are going to construct a story which delivers that experience, which delivers those scenes, and only then really do you start structuring it in a form that would be familiar to anybody who knows things like a screenplay structure, which you should probably throw away, honestly. But thinking about character arcs, thinking about story progression, thinking about foreshadowing and all the rest of it, that is built backwards. It's built from those experiences that we're trying to deliver, and how you get the player into a circumstance where they feel a particular way. That's really the core of how we do it at my company, but it varies massively. And there is a thing which Rihanna Pratchett, who's a well-known games writer, coined a term called narrative paramedic, which is when a writer gets dumped into a game when the game is probably 75% complete, and they get told, "Can you put a story around this, please?" So you can go from that extreme of having a blank slate and you can come up with a story and write everything from scratch, or you get dumped in at the end where they've got a game, it goes from scene to scene to scene, they don't really understand why or how it connects, but can you make a story that works and sounds good, and can you make it believable? And there's everything sort of between those 2 points. So it's it's still a relatively new form, and it's evolving all the time, but that key thing, as I said earlier, is just thinking about the player being at the center of it all.
So in terms of Joy, moving from TV and other sides of writing into video games, is it, like Amelia said, is it all about networking and just making contacts? And obviously I assume it would be very difficult to start writing for video games if you weren't a video game aficionado in the first place.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things really. There are some opportunities, but they're very small. There are some opportunities for going in and polishing existing dialogue, if you like. So if you're a good dialogue writer, there is that at that sort of editing level. But in terms of games writing, really, it's sort of similar to what Amelia was saying. The field is saturated with people who think that they know how to write, whether they think they know how to write because they've come from a screenwriting background or a literary background, or whether they've just come to the conclusion they can write. And people will not employ you on the basis of that. The thing that you need to be able to demonstrate is your ability to create interactive writing. Now, there are tools out there which you can use to create interactive pieces which don't require help from anybody else. All of the All of the instructions you need to do that, all the tutorials you need to do that are out there online. And the same is true for getting your music into a game, and the same is true for designing a game, and the same is true for even, you know, recording voice and getting it into a game. The best thing that you can deliver for any of these things is an example of something that actually is a game, not a bunch of text that people can go, I'm good at writing. And you go, well, yes, you can perfectly craft prose. That doesn't mean you have a clue how it works in games. Show me something which actually works in games. And the nice thing about living today is that the tools to do that are all out there. The tutorials to do that are out there. Ideally, collaborating with other people, as Stafford suggested, is fantastic. But even if you can't do that, you can find ways to make an interactive experience without having a huge depth of knowledge. And that is a far, far more valuable calling card and portfolio piece than, hey, look at my brilliant static prose. And as you said, just knowing your way around games, playing them, playing all varieties of them will help hugely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Sean, you were saying there's been quite a few questions about, you know, maybe to Di, if Di could answer this, but getting opportunities in the business and working, how do you get to work for various companies?
I'd actually like to tag on to the end of what Ian's saying about writing. So as well as video games, what you think of video games. So actually, Ian and Tailspin has worked on Made a Scare, which is one of our titles last year, which was narrative, a first-person horror, but what you think looks like a video game. We also make lots of interactive movies. So we work with film writers and TV writers. So we've, over the last 5 years, we've actually created our own tool, which allows writers to create non-linear stories, essentially. And then what we do is work with those writers, not to teach them to be good writers, because they already tell really great stories. We worked with Lynn Renee Maxey. She's an Emmy award-winning writer for Handmaid's Tale. So she worked on one of our last films, The Complex, but it was sold as an interactive movie. So we had to then teach her how to tell a non-linear story, how to build in game logic, you know, have rules in your script, so that the story then is filmed in exactly the same way, cinematic, but there's very many different layers to the scenes because there's different decisions to make and there's many different outcomes at the end of the film. So we've actually made, I suppose, a new job called interactive script writing now, which didn't exist even like, you know, a few years ago. So there are opportunities for people in the film and TV, linear writing, you know, talent skills to adapt to making interactive narratives. So again, I must reiterate though, whatever you think a video game is, go to walesinteractive.com, which is our company. And the last 3 titles we've had out are 2 movies, and one is what you class visually as a video game. They're all narrative. They're all sold as games. 2 are made as feature films, essentially, and distributed as games. Mm-hmm. And then in the wider thing, getting into the games industry. So my background, and Ian mentioned this, different people have different points. There's no one entry point, right? So Kevin did a course. When I started 26 years ago, there wasn't courses in games. There are many now. You can do an audio games course, a music games course. You can do an art games course. You can do an animation games course. You can do a writing games course. There's loads of them around for you to start to learn your trade. Equally, my entry point was my talent, my skill was I was an artist, I could draw. And I went to university, I did graphic design, but I knew when I graduated, I needed a job. And I connected my skill with my hobby, I suppose. I liked playing games, and I assumed somewhere out there, somebody must hire artists to do artwork for games. And that was my, so the next thing to do is initiative, and that never changes. If I hadn't been proactive, there was no internet then, so I had to literally turn around the boxes that are on my desk, because games came in boxes then, on a digital. And I wrote off and I sent off my show reel, which was basically a VHS tape, which I streamed out. I literally had to take apart because it was cheaper to post and stream out 2 hours, 55 minutes of tape, put my 3-minute footage of my animation and my art, and I dry sent it to loads of games companies around the UK then. So
Mhm.
forward now, it's easier to get access to communicating with games companies because they all have an online and social presence. And then really it's about your portfolio, you know, whether you're a writer, a voice artist, an animator, it's about connecting then and looking what opportunities are there. So
Yeah.
a positive note, I would say, I've never seen so many games industry jobs advertised over the last year, right?
Mhm.
And that's to do with the fact that even though, like, we, you know, I sort of a little bit when you said the emerging industry of games, it's not emerging this year. Like, I mean, it's not emerging, but I mean, last year we capitalized on more than ever because everybody was stuck in. So not just Netflix had a boost and Disney Plus, we sold even more games than we were selling anyway. So that means there's more games being made around the world and there's more opportunities for different disciplines. So, you know, it is a good time if you're looking to slide to see what your skill is and is it transferable. You know, that was a good opportunity, but it's not a fast fix. You know, it's definitely, it's one of those things you maneuver towards, not jump in two-footed unless you know, you're on that path really.
Yeah, I've got a question here as well. How can we find or better support our local games community?
Well, funny enough, Ian actually many years ago set up what was Games Dev, well, South Wales now, I suppose, and it's become Games Dev North. And there's a gameswales.com hub you can go to, and Kevin goes to that. So they have a meetup, and when you could meet up, they had a physical meetup. And basically that would be everybody from students to, I suppose, people working in the industry. Some people would meet up just to chat about games. Some would make relationships, end up creating companies together, you know. So there is a network already exists. Like I said, you just have to go online to find it.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question as well here. Is there anywhere in Wales where we can get into motion capture for video games, or is it currently only in London, or whether there are any courses?
I'm not sure about if anybody else knows about this, but
Anybody else?
I mean, the universities tend to have, so University of South Wales actually has its own motion capture studio, so sometimes they allow companies to use that. We don't actually use motion capture, so we have animators. They tend to hate motion capture because they spend most of the time tidying it up, you know. So for smaller indie companies, you're less likely to use motion capture. For the bigger companies, though, they use performance capture, everything, you know. So I'm not too sure, but I don't know if any of the other panel have any more information about that.
Anybody else on the panel got more info on that?
There's very little mocap in Wales. That's what it comes down to, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And I've got, again, a general question. I've got here, any advice for students or people with no experience who are looking to get into writing for video games? Any recommended learning resources? And, you know, so we've touched a bit about, you know, the best way to get noticed. Ian?
So I've just posted actually a link to an article I wrote a while back on getting into games writing, because it's something that people keep asking me. So I thought I'd write it down instead of having to say the same thing. In terms of resources, there is a good book that came out maybe 5-6 years ago now called The Game Narrative Toolbox, which is really useful. It's got a whole series of different exercises in it to demonstrate different writing skills, and it helps you develop a portfolio. So that's worth looking at. But as with anything else, if you're a student or whatever you are, the best thing to do to get into making games is to make games. And everything you need to do that is out there, and you will find other people in the same situation as you who want to be actors, who want to be sound designers, who want to be musicians, designers, and they're in the same boat as you. So get together with them. All the tools you need are out there. All the tutorials you need are out there. Just make a game. And I know that's trivializing it, but it's by far the best way to actually start getting into the industry, to have something to demonstrate in the industry. Yeah, just do it.
Just do it, yeah.
Can I put out a plea from the voice actor side of things as well, because this is something that Ian is clearly very good at doing. I've worked with him a couple of times. If you are a writer, please read your words out loud, because you'd be surprised how many people don't do that. And if there are weird words in there, maybe record a pronunciation guide. Did I mention I'm recording a D&D game? Yeah, pronunciation guides are really important. Reading words out loud so that they flow is really important. Thank you, Ian, for being great.
Yeah, Stafford, you were saying something?
I was just going to second that, definitely. Read it out loud. I'm working on a fantasy game, and we had some words that we sent so many recordings out and saying we actually recorded it ourselves, saying this is how you say this word, and it's essential.
Yeah, stuff like that is invaluable, and it'll save you so much time and money.
Yeah, I've got a question here for Amelia, actually. What did it say? Hang on a sec. It's just yeah. For Amelia, I'm a Spotlight registered actor and have a show reel uploaded, but I rarely see voiceover opportunity on the Spotlight platform. Is a voiceover agent the answer to accessing more voiceover opportunity?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Yes, but I think would be the answer to that. Like, yes, you will get much more opportunity if you've got a voice agent, because that's what they're for. But you cannot rely on your agent to do your work for you. If all you're doing is checking Spotlight and waiting for auditions to come in, you're gonna have to be incredibly lucky to make a career. If I waited for all my work to come in through my agent, I wouldn't have been into Divinity Original Sin 2. Like, that went through my agent, but that's not where the initial contact came from. I wouldn't be in Baldur's Gate 3. Like, I would say probably 90% of my voice work I have sourced myself and put through my agent.
Yeah.
So you've got to do that. Networking is the wrong way to go about it. That's not what makes sense to me, but you have to be doing the legwork yourself, because no agent is ever going to vouch for you and work for you as hard as you will work for yourself. And I think that's true in any industry. You have to be your first energy pushing yourself forward towards people who are going to want to hire you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can second that in terms of writing as well. Probably 99.9% of my work I found myself, and obviously you put it through an agent for contractual reasons, but yeah, you have to do it definitely yourself. There's a question here as well, and I know Ian sort of got back to somebody on this, but just in case people didn't see this, would you recommend using a tool such as Twine for portfolio work or for narrative design, or any other suggestions to add to your portfolio?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I replied in I've posted a link there to an article which mentions that. But yes, Twine is a tool which lets you create interactive stories that people can play through, a bit like the old Choose Your Own Adventure books, if anybody's old enough to remember those. And it's quite a good way of producing an interactive portfolio in a very straightforward way.
And we've got a question which resonates with me definitely, because as I say, have I played a video? I think I have played a video game in my life. I think so. Where would you recommend an inexperienced gamer to start playing? What iconic games? Good examples of the art. So that's a big question, I know, but I was amazed personally to know that there was a game about a woman who had adopted a child and who was having issues, for example. I had no idea that kind of game existed. But yeah, so in terms of the panelists, what do you think for somebody who's just not experienced in playing games?
Personally, coming at it from a non-designer point of view, I would say, what kind of films are you into, and go to a recommendation from there, because it will help narrow down the categories. Because there's no point putting a puzzle game in front of somebody who just doesn't think like that. They'll have an awful time. Games like My Child Lebensborn and Florence are fantastic for people who want to be using a mobile phone and follow a story, follow some emotions through. I've recommended Portal to a lot of people because that's a great puzzle game. It's pretty simple, opening people's eyes to what's out there, and the voice work is fantastic. So it's a good overall. And if you can handle a shooter, The Last of Us is a great intro, acting wise.
Great. Anybody else?
I just my go-to, if you want to be wowed by what games can do, and you're from a sort of cinema background at all, is Uncharted 4. Mainly because what it shows, there's an astounding sequence in the very beginning where you're playing through what you think is a sort of cutscene, and then you realize that it's not, and you can control everything. But essentially, it marries the art department, the sound department, the design, the scripting, the coding, the audio, the voice, everything into an interactive piece where the player feels like they're in control in a way that just hasn't been equaled, really. And for people whose last game was Tetris, it will completely change your idea about how this medium can deliver things in a way that no other medium can. So it's a great high watermark. It's not as effective as some other games doing particular things. And also, if you're not into action games, if you're not into Indiana Jones movies, for example, if you want something quieter and more puzzly, it's not the thing to do. But just as a benchmark example, it's a stunning piece of work.
Great. I've got a question here as well. I've found somebody who's working for an independent TV company that creates programming. Maybe Di could answer this one. I look after all the digital media projects we do, motion graphics, web, illustration, etc. And I'm wondering if there are opportunities to work with any games companies in Wales.
So at the moment, we've got, I think, 5 films in production at the moment. So we're always actively working with many different people in Wales of all different disciplines. So I would say if it was for my company, walesinteractive.com is a contact form. You can drop down menu and say, pick the heading what it's for, and you can get in touch with us to put your hand up for whatever discipline you have. So we released 3 titles last year. This year it'll probably be 6, and because we've got overproduction line now, COVID has hit us a bit for the film side of things, but we sort of adapted to that. In fact, 5 Dates is the first ever romantic comedy game, film game, which we released just before Christmas, and that was a reaction. That project happened because of COVID, because of actors being locked in and the production team or whatever. So we adapted in that time to make a script. So I would say for us, you can go to our website and send respectively a contact message. In Wales, you're just literally going to have to do your research, see what companies are hiring or whatever. That landscape changes every year, especially for games. We've been a constant. We've released over, I don't know, I think it's 40 titles now. We've sold millions of games worldwide. So we've been very much the constant in the games industry in Wales for quite a long time now. But there will be others. But off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody that are not work for hire, unfortunately.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Di. I've got something as well for staff here. Can you please give us composers some advice on where do gaming companies get their music from? Which music libraries are best for us to be in contact with?
Hang on, I then mute my mic. Yeah, it's difficult, really. A lot of companies get their music from established composers. There's established names and people who they work with. A lot of it comes through I say networking, not networking events, but it's a very organic, long-lasting process. It echoes a lot of what Amelia said. It's getting involved with the games community, talking to people, going along to, well, obviously we can't at the moment because of COVID, but going along to things like EGX Resd, to the developer conference down in Brighton, and meeting people, talking to them, getting involved with online communities around games. And game developers, indie game developers. Game developers tend to work with people whom they know, or in their mind space, basically, you know, and it's a very long process, and you know, it's not. I don't know. It really depends on how on, you know, you could aggressively market to yourself, but as I said, many games developers, they just get tons of show reels in all the time, you know, demo reels, and you know, I certainly know that when I used to work in house, working at Codemasters, you know, I hate to say this, but we'd get, you know, 20 or 30 demo CDs a week, and we just put them in the bin because we haven't got the time to, we wouldn't have the time to listen to them, and we already have the composers who we worked with. But the games industry has changed so much in the last 10, 15 years, and the indie development scene, and as Ian mentioned, the democratization of game development through game development tools and middleware means that there is such a huge and expanding industry now. There's so many people working on things, that, you know, the opportunities are there, but it's about making contacts. If you're a student, and if, you know, if you are doing a music technology course or even a game audio course at a university, it's so vital early on to find people who are working on projects, actually making stuff, getting involved, doing stuff for free, not in that awful way where people say, hey, in return for exposure, but teaming up with people to do stuff, you know, by getting something out there that is playable, that is really, I would say, is the best way to start. The flip side of it is that it's not the path to riches and glory, but there are websites like Shockwave Sound, which music libraries, and so, you know, you've got your library music, and I'm sure many TV producers will be familiar with websites like this where you can purchase royalty-free music. A lot of the smaller developers will just use music from there, so that is another potential avenue.
Right.
Just to go back to the question about what games people should play if they've never played games or want to get up to date, The Guardian did an article in the autumn about that, answering that very question. I will see if I can dig a link out for it, and I can email it.
Great.
I can email it or find, you know, dig the link out, and it mentions a whole array of different games to play, including, I'm not one to kind of blow my own trumpet much, but Monument Valley, which was a project I worked on, which kind of made I made a new name for myself, even though I've been in the industry for a long time. A lot of people who played Monument Valley had never played video games and weren't your typical video games player, and it resonated with a lot of people. So I would say that's worth checking out as well.
Yeah.
If you don't fancy, like, you know, if it's all too intimidating, guns blazing, cars flying around, all that kind of thing, it's a very chilled out experience with narrative and music and some very sublime game design as well.
Great. Just, there was a question here, but maybe you've sort of answered it in a sense. As a newbie, what format do the games team require as music submissions? Obviously, you don't want to be bombarded with submissions, but they're just asking about the format here.
In terms of format, I mean, I don't know. Format can mean so many things, like whether it's a, you know, a stereo recording or a demo reel. The other thing that might be possibly worth looking into, something I used to recommend to people a few years ago, was one of the middleware tools for audio called WWise. The Audio Kinetic, who make it, used to have a download on their website where you could download a special build of a game called Limbo, and you could replace all the sounds and music within the game and then create a build, and you could run the game with your own sounds. I think that's since been depreciated, but it may be worth looking for things out worth looking for projects out there. Maybe I know certainly that on the Unity store, which is like an online store that's part of the Unity middleware tool, there are project templates on there, like really basic template games with assets in. It may be possible to download one of those and transplant your sounds and music into it. I would have to do some research on that and get back to you and see what.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, on that point, I know we're running out of time, but on that point, we will send all the participants to this panel the links, you know, and information that all our panelists have kindly shared. Just maybe, just one last question for Diary. Why is Wales small in terms of games companies when the present future money is in the industry? Is it due to location and funding with publishers in Wales? That was quite a big question, I suppose.
Yeah, where do I start? So, so basically, when I started in the games industry as an individual wanting to make games, I'd made it. I was getting paid for my talent to use my skill as artist to make games. So I'd made it. I'd achieved. I'd summited pen a van as such, right? So when I was in the games industry and I wanted to have my first title out, and then I wanted to have a hit. But I always knew that I wanted to make my own games company. And I knew that eventually, once I had enough knowledge, I would come back to Wales, which I did at the end of the 90s. Unfortunately, there wasn't a tick box for the line of work that we did. If I manufactured the CDs that to make games, they could fund me. But the fact they didn't understand that I created something which was digital, which went onto the CD. So essentially, at the end of the 90s, there wasn't an understanding in Wales. It was then the Welsh Development Agency that this was a thing or going to be a thing. My first games company I set up was in Scotland because they did know, and they were way ahead. So they had a tick box for what I did, and I created a games company, and we were up in Fort William for about 4 years, actually, right? A part of the reason they wanted us to go up there so they could put the first broadband line up to Fort William from there, right? So then fast forward to, I suppose, 2008, the same question came again. I went to then the Welsh Government, still didn't understand what it was. There wasn't really a tick box for our industry. So that's what the thing that changed then was, instead of just accepting it, I got involved and lobbied Welsh Government. So then ended up actually teaming up with people like Ian and made a collective of people. So it still exists to this day called Games Wales. And we lobbied Welsh Government to make a tick box for the games industry. I ended up with a few shows, which I was the event coordinator was. So basically what I did was, rather than moan about it, I went there and changed policy. So the reason it hasn't been, it was fundamentally there wasn't support. There is now. It's not perfect, but we are acknowledged now, and that's being changed as well. I'm actually on the Creative Wales board now, so I get to make games more of a priority, or at least influence that. So it's not because of a lack of people wanting to set up in Wales. It's just a lack of understanding, especially for when you set up a business. Just being an entrepreneur is different. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. It's hard to set up a business and get that off the ground. So the extra barrier in Wales is the fact that the industry wasn't really understood and wasn't supported. But it is, and it's still, again, it's becoming part of the agenda going forward, I would say, for the next 5 years now. So hopefully that will change.
That's great, Di. So we run out of time, so quickly wanted to ask the panel, I think that's a good note to end on with Di. If each person in the panel could just say a few words, something that, a tip to pass on or whatever. Should we start with Ian?
Okay, just repeat what I said before. This stuff is out there for you to create. Just go and make things, go and explore things. Don't wait for somebody to hand it to you on a plate. You can go and make games now, collaborate with other people to do so. Riffing off what Amelia says very slightly earlier, you want to stand out and be an individual and do things that people will know that you're the person who does that kind of thing, rather than generically trying to tick all the boxes, because that won't really get you anywhere. Nobody will remember who you are. And all of this talk about it being restricted in Wales, as COVID has hammered home, it doesn't really matter where you are now at all. So just don't worry about the geographical location part of it. You can work from, you know, somewhere on the side of a mountain. As long as you've got decent broadband, you can work for big companies across the world. So don't worry about that part, and maybe start looking outwards a bit.
Great, thanks, Ian. Kevin?
Yeah, I'd probably say just like, don't be afraid to make mistakes and just like get working on things, you know, like try starting your own project. If you want to be a writer, like learn how to get all of the written stuff into a game as well, because once you do that, it shows whoever you might work with that you've got that drive to like learn more, and then you can like communicate with each other a lot better, like just being able to say, all right, I've written this and I think you can put it in A, B, and C, instead of just saying, here's a script, have it, you know. So yeah, just try to learn as much as you can. And also, networking isn't as scary as you think it is. A lot of people think that networking is all business, but it's just, if they don't like you for the person you are anyway, like there's no point trying to sell a business version of yourself. So just like be yourself and try to gel with people who's like more your speed, you know.
Lovely, thanks, Kev. Staff?
I would say definitely, if you're not already, play games. Find out what's out there, what's being done musically and being done with audio. You've got to be passionate about it. You've got to be driven, definitely. And as Ian said, you know, the opportunities are there now to create stuff, connect with communities, team up with people, and yeah, pretty much all I could add. One little caveat: I noticed that Games Wales has been mentioned a couple of times. I would say it's not the institution that it used to be. There are people on there to communicate, but talk tends to be a lot more these days about playing games rather than making them. So yeah.
Thanks. And Amelia?
They forget any idea of what you think success will look like, because in 5 years that'll be completely different. Stop trying to swim against the river and just lie back and see where it takes you. Take opportunities that excite you, because if you say yes to stuff that makes you happy, you're going to end up in a place with a career that makes you happy. Whether or not that's what you thought it would be at the beginning, who knows? I didn't think I'd be here.
That's great. Thanks, Amelia. And Di, one last thing.
Yeah, my wife said I haven't had a proper job for 26 years, so long may that continue. So that's probably, so I mean, if you can find, if you can get a job that you love, then obviously that old adage, you know, you'll never work, you know. So I've been fortunate to do that, and I really love the industry that I'm in. So I'm a big champion for it.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much to all our panelists. It's been really fascinating, and hopefully everybody's enjoyed it. I'll be sending through some feedback forms. If you've got any feedback you'd like to give us for future events, is really important. Just be as honest as you want to be. We're here for you, so we want to make sure that anything Cult Cymru organises is useful. And yeah, I think that's about it, isn't it, Sian?
Yeah, just diolch yn fawr pawb. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks, Annalisa, for chairing so fantastically. And thanks, everybody, for coming with us this morning on this journey. Remember, you are supported in this sector, so keep in touch and let us know how we can work collaboratively together. So diolch yn fawr pawb and keep safe.
Diolch yn fawr.
Mask.